Hey all, I don't normally give a verbal content warning for my videos, but the subject matter for this one's kind of a doozy, so if any of these topics are potentially upsetting to you, you might want to sit this one out. See you next time. Alright, before we start, let's get the obvious joke out of the way. Yes, this video's talking about the First Omen. Not the First Omen, that's the Omen, but not that Omen. And this is the First Omen, which is technically the Sixth Omen, but called the First Omen because it's a prequel to the Omen. Not that Omen, this Omen. So it's the First Omen, but not the First Omen. That's the Omen. Get it? Got it? Good, moving on. A few years back, I made a video talking a little bit about the original Omen movie released in 1976. Describing how it not only became one of my personal favorite movies, but also my proper introduction to the horror film genre as a whole. And you could honestly do way worse than The Omen as your first foray into the fright zone. With its spellbinding cinematography courtesy of Gilbert Taylor, who I literally just found out also did the cinematography for the original Star Wars. Ain't that something? The sinister soundtrack courtesy of Jerry Goldsmith, and spectacular performance from a stacked ensemble cast, mixed together through the sleek feature film directorial debut of the late Richard Donner. The Omen may be showing its age a little in the near 50 years since its release, but it's fondly remembered as a classic staple in the horror film echelon for a very good reason. Given that the film was also a resounding box office success, it was only natural that 20th Century Fox would strike while the iron was hot and turn it into a franchise. With two sequels, Damien Omen 2 and Omen 3 The Final Conflict, releasing in the span of 5 years. Each movie saw diminishing returns and lukewarm reception from critics, and though they've tried to keep the franchise alive through various reboots and TV shows, by the time of the mid-2010s, it seemed that the Omen franchise was doomed to remain dormant. And to be honest, I was perfectly fine with that. Though I enjoy the sequels well enough for what they were, and even found the TV show to be an interesting character study for the titular Antichrist if nothing else, I was more than happy to let the legacy of the original Omen stand by itself. No more remakes, no more sequels, no more attempts to keep the franchise going. It had its time in the sun, and now it had long since set over the horizon. So when news dropped that a prequel movie had begun early development in 2016, I was less than enthused.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Look, I try not to be an outwardly cynical person if I can help it. But if there's one descriptor that is almost always guaranteed to be cinematic poison, it's horror movie prequel. Hell, just movie prequel has enough negative connotations to draw a healthy dose of skepticism from anybody. And in the case of The Omen, there's really not that much to the story that needed explaining in the form of a prequel to begin with. Sure, the details of Damien's parentage leaves a lot to the imagination, but that's kind of what's so effective about it in the first place. It's a lot creepier imagining just how Damien came to be than the movie having a concrete explanation. Just as it's always scarier whenever a movie expects you to fill in the gaps yourself about nearly anything it leaves to interpretation. So even to those who are familiar with my channel and the more positive outlook I try to bring with anything I talk about, I think you'll understand when I say I wasn't exactly chomping at the bit to see this upcoming prequel based on a movie I really loved come to fruition. Honestly, after Disney's takeover of 20th Century Fox was completed in 2019, and they started tying up their loose projects and even studios, I thought for sure that meant that the Omen prequel was dead in the water. I mean, if even a potential Die Hard movie was shelved, what hope did the little Antichrist that could have? This is why, when the first trailer for this prequel film finally dropped in early January this year, I was caught completely off guard by it in the best possible way. No plot synopsis, no character info, just a couple of out-of-context clips played in reverse, culminating in a very familiar backwards message.
Look at me, Damien. It's all for you.
Well, you get the picture.
And though I remained somewhat skeptical even after this pleasant surprise, nearly all the subsequent marketing for this movie slowly but surely won me over. I mean, me being the Omen superfan that I am, I would have seen it regardless. But when you go to the trouble of making a vintage-style trailer that even uses the original movie trailer's tagline,
"If this is the truth, where does it end?"
If this is the truth, where does it end?
this marketing campaign was made for me, right? Like, specifically for me. Come on. Even when some plot details were revealed that didn't seem to match up with the established lore of the original movie, I was still much more open to it than I ever was before. And when the largely favorable reviews started to pour in, I was even more intrigued. I mean, the last Omen movie to see the fresh side of the tomato meter was the 1976 original. To clarify, there's been like 3 other movies since then. And with critics being particularly harsh towards horror prequels in particular, whenever one gets even halfway decent positive buzz, you gotta stand up and pay attention to it. And stand up I did, driving to the nearest theater on April 5th, and treating myself to the very first Omen movie I ever saw in theaters. And boy, Captain Howdy, that's an Exorcist reference, but whatever. It was an experience in bleak discomfort that I won't soon forget.
You don't have to be afraid. This child is his way.
The first Omen centers around novitiate Margaret Dano, played by Nell Tiger Free, arriving in Rome to teach young girls at an orphanage before taking her vows. During her stay, she becomes drawn to the orphanage's local problem child, Carlita Sciana, played by Nicole Sarace, whom the other nuns insist to be a lost cause, best left to be seen and unheard. Margaret, regarded as a problem child in her own youth, takes the girl under her wing, much to the disapproval of the abbess, Sister Silva, played by Sonia Braga. Not long into her stay, however, she is approached by a priest named Father Brennan, played by Ralph Ineson, who warns her that the abbey has dark intentions for Carlita, and that evil things will start to happen around her. Though skeptical at first, as more and more terrible events occur around Margaret and the other girls, she may have to accept that these unfortunate incidents are but mere omens to the evil that is yet to come. If you've ever seen the original movie, then a lot of what I just surmised will probably sound very familiar. On the surface, the First Omen mirrors the structure of the First Omen. I'm not even trying to be funny, they really screwed me with that title. In nearly every way, right down to repeating a number of the original's most memorable death sequences. However, where most horror prequels will use this kind of structure as a crutch to remind the viewer of the better movie, the First Omen isn't content to go that route. It instead uses these familiar scenes and moments to subvert the audience's expectations, basically pulling a yoink and twist on many of these moments that might otherwise feel trite or rote. Hell, even the perspective of the main character is noticeably different from past films in the series, as all of them have focused on either a high-ranking politician or businessman. Or, the Antichrist. But what's the difference, am I right? There was a noticeable shift in perspective behind the camera as well, with first-time feature-length director Akasha Stevenson becoming the first woman to direct an Omen movie, alongside handling the screenplay with her writing partner Tim Smith and screenwriter Keith Thomas. Being a self-professed big fan of the original movie, Stevenson took her job very seriously in delivering a movie that could not only tell a worthy origin story of Damien's conception, but also a film that could stand by itself. And I largely believe she succeeded with flying colors. The First Omen is not only a great Omen movie, possibly the first really great Omen movie since the '76 version, depending on how forgiving you are of the sequels. It revitalizes the series in a number of ways that both feel relevant to how society has progressed, or even regressed, in the near 50 years since the first movie's release, while also staying true to its roots as a movie taking place firmly in the early 70s, with all the political and societal unrest that implies. It's a movie I haven't been able to get out of my mind ever since I first saw it, and I'm beyond excited to talk about it now that it's finally available on digital and streaming, and now on Blu-ray because it still takes me forever to make even shorter videos. That being said, there will be spoilers throughout this video, so if you're even a smidgen interested in the First Omen, I highly recommend you seek it out for yourself. It's available on Hulu in the States and through Star on Disney Plus internationally, which I'm still tickled by even to this day. Although I must reiterate that you should go in with extreme caution. This movie wasn't nearly rated NC-17 for nothing. And why exactly did it just barely manage to avoid that rating? Well... this will make more sense later, I promise. It's often said that the horror genre reflects the darker aspects or unspoken anxieties of the culture surrounding it. The zombies of George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead representing mindless consumerism. The eldritch entities of H.P. Lovecraft representing his... truly appalling racism, I mean, my goodness. And in the midst of the rising counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s, a lot of horror movies that came out around this time took a more Christian bend to their scares, often featuring some kind of clash between the old versus new, either through the characters or their belief systems. These movies featured either lapsed Catholic or irreligious protagonists facing a terrible demonic force that challenged their ideas of faith, and, in a lot of cases, failing to triumph over that evil, possibly mirroring the anxieties of those in the faith about secularism overtaking them. In the 50 years since movies like The Exorcist or Rosemary's Baby were released, we've definitely seen an ebb and flow to the way religion, more specifically Christianity, plays in our society, with pushback from militant Christian groups rising to meet the counterculture groups and vice versa ad nauseum. Be that in the satanic panic of the 1980s, that saw such things as Dungeons and Dragons being claimed as tools for the devil, or in the recent conspiracy theories involving supposed satanic rituals among the elites of Hollywood or Washington, D.C. Most of them being strangely left-leaning figures. Isn't that peculiar? It's incredibly fitting, then, that this new Omen film takes place in 1971, amidst long-going counterculture protests in Rome, that would later be known as the Years of Lead. In real life, these protests cover 2 decades worth of political turmoil across all sides of the political spectrum. But for our purposes, when Margaret first arrives to Rome and is given a backseat tour by her mentor, Cardinal Lawrence, played by Bill Nighy, he defines these protests as another example of the youths protesting for the sake of protesting, a rejection of authority and the church in general.
The younger generation no longer turn to us for guidance, I'm afraid. Perhaps you'll play your part and help earn back their trust.
It's both incredibly genius to root this movie's early 70s time period in a real-life political event, and to tie it into the modern-day rise of secularism and protests among the youth culture of millennials and Gen Zers. I mean, millennials are still considered youths, right? We're still hip with it, right? I'm not that old yet. Right? It's a well-researched fact that less and less Americans over the past 30 years self-identify as Christian or religious in general, and that many who were raised in the faith later went through a period of deconstruction in their young adult years. I was raised Christian myself until I saw the true light of kindly Mikola, who just wants to bring about an age of compassion and never did anything wrong ever, but I digress. So the First Omen's decision to take this anxiety of an ever-approaching post-religious society and incorporate it into the very origin of Damien is downright ingenious, and adds even more depth to the conspiracy surrounding him than ever before. When Margaret goes to see Father Brennan in his apartment about halfway into the film, he more or less spells out this theme as the very reason this conspiracy started in the first place. That the extremist branch of the church spearheading this scheme worries about the younger generation abandoning them, losing the power they've had over the common folk for centuries, because they lack fear in the darker prophecies of the Bible.
Now how do you control people who no longer believe in your stories of fire and brimstone? You create something to fear.
Me being the Omen purist that I am, I thought it might take away from the original movie's Antichrist conspiracy to give it a more detailed explanation. But I was completely wrong. It's much scarier to imagine a group of overly devoted followers of the Christian church bringing about the son of their supposed adversary to drive more people back into their open and loving arms. It kind of draws retroactive suspicion onto some of the other agents around Damien's life, like Mrs. Baylock. Are they a shadowy group of Satanists as previously suggested? Or are they part of the same extremist branch of Christians trying to rein him in? And it's not like the movie goes super hard and treats all nuns or priests as evil. Father Brennan is careful to point out the difference between the people who follow Christ, like him and Margaret, and the more extremist branch who covet power and influence, turning a blind eye to the hypocrisy in their hierarchy. But unfortunately, in the text of this movie and in real life, it's the more extremist voices that rise to the top. The people who are willing to commit terrible atrocities to enact their view of God's will, to foolishly believe that they can birth the Antichrist and control it to exert their dominance for as long as possible.
Allow him to bring his dark forces to bear on the world just enough to drive people back to the church.
You know, it kind of speaks to the forward thinking of these people that they believe they can control the Antichrist just enough to get people back into the church without considering any of the consequences in the interim.
You see, phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, phase 3, profit.
Oh, I get it. No, you don't, fat ass.
These themes of political and religious turmoil have gone hand in hand with the Omen franchise ever since the beginning. Even during the making of the original movie, production found themselves indirectly crossing paths with the IRA when they bombed the hotel some of the crew happened to be staying at, and then a restaurant that Gregory Peck planned to take the crew to eat. A morbid but darkly fitting coincidence for a series centered around a character such as Damien. After all, as the old poem says, "From the eternal sea he rises, creating armies on either shore, turning man against his brother, till man exists no more." However, as previously stated, the focal viewpoint of this story is much different than what has come before. Or after? Look, you get it, it's a prequel. As it's not from the eternal sea where our main character arises, but the humble cloth of a young novitiate, who genuinely wants to do good in her position, and spread the love of Christ to everyone, even those deemed a lost cause, but is in for a very rude awakening when her superiors don't share in her vision. This is where Margaret has to face her own demons, and confront something that's all too familiar to a lot of those who came from a faith-based background. When Margaret arrives in Rome and assumes her new position, she demonstrates not only her general meekness due to her lingering childhood trauma, but also her genuine desire to help those who— sorry, this is the wrong movie. When Margaret arrives in Rome and assumes her new position, she demonstrates not only her general meekness due to lingering childhood trauma, but also her genuine desire to help those who are going through the same trauma. It's the reason why, when she meets Carlita, she's immediately compelled to protect her, even when she makes a pretty poor first impression.
What are you doing? Get off of me!
Margaret mentions to her roommate and fellow novitiate that she was something of a problem child herself, that she would sometimes see horrible visions that would cause her to act out, leading to the other nuns subduing her.
What if she has another episode? Then you must tie her to the bed. Here, let me show you.
She claims that it was Cardinal Lawrence who helped improve her behavior by showing her the visions were just figments of her overactive mind, explaining why she would decide to take the veil herself and pay that kindness forward to other girls like her, even when she clearly still has a deep-seated fear of nuns due to her trauma. Margaret's sympathy for Carlita, whom the other nuns dismiss as being just bad, helps to bring the troubled girl out of her shell, and demonstrate that when someone is willing to be patient with her and treat her no different than the other girls, then she truly is no different from any other young teen her age. There's a Bible verse you hear a lot if you've ever worked or volunteered in children's ministry, where Jesus says, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." And Margaret lives out this verse in treating all the girls in her care as equals, even when Sister Silva justifies their harsh treatment of Carlita as for her own good. that she's a danger to herself and others, better left to her own devices away from everyone else in the bad room.
Why is there a bad room?
Because some girls are bad.
Considering this was the 1970s, and a traditionally Catholic orphanage at that, it's a given that mental health issues were not as widely understood as they are these days, and that the antics of Carlita or even Margaret when she was growing up in the 50s and 60s would be met with such extreme harshness. But even in the modern day, there are some sects of Christians who hold a stigma against modern psychiatric help, be that in the form of antidepressants, ADHD medicine, or just plain psychiatry in general.
If you'd like, I can recommend a good psychiatrist. Hello?
Of course, there's a bit more going on in these movies than just mental health issues. But taking these behaviors at face value, a lot of what Carlita and Margaret go through can be explained on a mundane level as purely the result of religious trauma.
The things we do aren't always pleasant, but they are in the name of God.
And as Margaret grows closer to Carlita, and is warned by Father Brennan that the nuns and priests of the orphanage may have dark intentions for her, it seems that a lot of this past trauma is resurfaced, seeing all manner of twisted and vivid hallucinations the more she tries to find the truth. This is the reason Sister Silva gives as to why she thinks Margaret should keep her distance from the girl, conveniently stating that prolonged exposure to Carlita's troubled nature may bring back her own repressed tendencies. Margaret, of course, calls BS on this.
The girl is sick in the head.
Because of you.
With how rebellious Margaret gets concerning Carlita's well-being throughout the movie, and taking into account her own trauma from being the bad girl, one kind of has to wonder why she even wanted to become a nun in the first place. Hell, even with her roommate Luce.
I didn't even think that would work.
Not that Luce, who was introduced coming back from some kind of swanky club. When she talks about her motivation behind taking her vows, you still have to wonder, why?
I was 16, just kicked out of the house. And then this warm wind came, and suddenly it was as if his voice was all around me. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged on this earth.
Oh, I get it. She's gay. Perhaps it's purely my penchant for talking about sapphic Luces on this channel, but a lot of the behavior of this Luce, played by Maria Caballero, and the rather close relationship she forges with Margaret in a very short time, can easily be read through a sapphic lens. And yeah, there is a bit more to Luce striking up a fast friendship with Margaret than her just being friendly. But even knowing what part Luce plays in the conspiracy, there's still a lot about these two and how they interact that ain't exactly straight.
Margaret will be alone in the chapel too. Don't worry, I'll warm it up for you.
Look, I get it. It's the internet. Everybody sees rainbow flags in everything they watch because we're so starved for actual representation otherwise. But I am telling you, there is some definite subtext going on here with all the lingering shots of Margaret staring at Luce, or the way Luce cozies up to her before they go out to a club, or the way Margaret watches Luce dance with a guy later on with what could almost be perceived as jealousy or even longing.
I just figured a little exploration is healthy before the big day.
Whoa, gay, 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 gay.
Taking off my rainbow-tinted glasses for a second, there's nothing in the movie that explicitly suggests that Margaret or Luce are sapphic, and the awkward way Margaret stares at her in certain scenes could as well be her shock at seeing someone so open considering her own meek nature. But I'm just saying, even when she dances with the guy at the club, she has to psych herself up and down a few drinks before she really lets loose. And for the record, Paolo is gay too.
I was watching this movie with my mother yesterday and was with Barbara Streisand, and I love her. And
this also isn't just me shipping two girls together for the hell of it. I think this subtext actually strengthens Margaret as a character and the theme of religious trauma as a whole. The way Luce talks about how she was thrown out by her family at 16 and wandering aimlessly until she found her calling at the church. and how she's later revealed to be in on the conspiracy to birth the Antichrist. It's not out of the question to imagine that she might have been preyed upon by the conspirators during the lowest point in her life. That she might have turned to the cloth because she believed something was genuinely wrong with her. The way a lot of queer youth might turn to other sources if they want to ignore their innate feelings regarding their sexuality or desired gender. To pray the gay away, as it were. And yeah, Luce doesn't necessarily have to be sapphic to have been thrown out by her family or seek something to fill a void in her life. But it would make sense given the time period. I haven't been able to find any interviews with Arkasha Stevenson or any of the other writers that might shed some light on if this reading was intentional or not. And I haven't seen a lot of other people talking about it, so maybe I am just crazy. But I think what lends this reading some credence is in the scene where Luce officially takes her vows. By this point, Margaret has become wholly disillusioned with the orphanage and the people who run it, and has been denied taking her vows due to her growing paranoia. Luce, however, is free to take her own vows the very next day. And apparently in certain ceremonies, when they say nuns are the brides of Christ, they mean that in the most literal sense imaginable. Luce is done up in a fancy wedding dress, is given a ring, and her robes are immediately slapped on her with all the pomp and circumstance of a wedding. And throughout the ceremony, and even before it, at no point does this look like anything Luce actually wants. Seeing the wild and carefree young woman who loved to go out and party, loved to express herself and have fun, look so solemn and almost forlorn. It's not hard to share in Margaret's melancholy as she watches the ceremony unfold. It may just be a product of her own disillusionment, but it's not for nothing that watching Luce go through with this is the catalyst that gets her to really dig deep on the conspiracy brought to her attention by Father Brennan. And as she searches, the rest of the ceremony plays out, with Luce literally being restrained by her garbs, looking no more satisfied or fulfilled than before she took her vows. Again, this is all purely speculation on my part unless somebody involved in this movie comes out, and says otherwise. But Luce and Margaret developing feelings for each other, or even Margaret discovering that she has these feelings to begin with, makes their eventual rift due to the Antichrist conspiracy all the more meaningful. Where both women never really had the self-compassion to ask themselves whether this was something they truly wanted, or if it was something they went along with, because they felt like there was nothing else that they could do, and there was nowhere else for them to go. That no one else could love them because of how broken they were. And it's not like becoming a nun is the end of the world or anything, although in this case it kinda is. But when Luce and Margaret behave the way they do during this ceremony, and it's presented as such a solemn event, you're still left with the question of why they would choose to do this to themselves when they clearly don't want it. And therein lies the rub. Because, at least in Margaret's case, becoming a novitiate is implied to have never really been her choice in the first place, in keeping with one of the other major themes of this movie. A topic that is all too familiar in both the church and secular societies. A woman's bodily autonomy, or lack thereof. Boy, I am not staying in my lane today, am I? At the heart of the conspiracy, the nuns and priests involved wish to bring about a supernatural birth through less than ideal or consensual methods, which will naturally draw— okay, this is the wrong movie again, what the hell is going— which will naturally draw parallels to the ever-present topic of a woman's right to her own body, and all that implies.
Please don't let it touch me again.
But even before the conspiracy is brought to light, it's made apparent within the first few minutes of Margaret's screen time that her becoming a novitiate was probably not her going after a lifelong dream, but more so fulfilling a role that she had been primed for. Upon arriving in Rome and seeing the city from the back seat of Cardinal Lawrence's welcome wagon, she excitedly remarks how wonderful the city is, and how it makes her want to get out and explore it. To which Cardinal Lawrence replies,
What better place for you to be taking the veil?
and she visibly deflates. As I've said before, Margaret takes her position very seriously and seeks to use it to break the cycle of trauma that she endured as a kid. But as she starts to clue in that the Abbey might be grooming Carlita into fulfilling the role of the mother of the Antichrist, she starts to rebel against them much more violently, even at the cost of being forced to relive some of her old trauma. But we can't really talk about bodily autonomy without getting into the nitty-gritty of the conspiracy itself. So I must stress, if you're uncomfortable with themes of SA involving women and animals, skip to this timestamp or click off the video entirely if you need to. Discretion is the better part of valor and all that. Brennan explains earlier on that the conspirators have a very specific method in trying to birth the Antichrist. They believe that the baby has to be born a male, and that the conception can only be successful if the father mates with its own offspring. Gross enough on its own, but anyone who's familiar with the lore of the original movie will know Damien's parentage wasn't exactly human.
A jackal! Jackal! It's a jackal! It looks like a jackal! 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 It's a jackal! Jackal!
Time!
It wasn't right the first time you said it! Why the hell would it be right the next 10 times? God!
The one major nitpick I always had ever since I first read the synopsis of the movie is that it's distinctly mentioned in pretty much every film in the original Omen trilogy that Damien's mother was a jackal, and that the dad was presumably Satan himself getting freaky with it.
Well, think about it. You really think God would have sex with a porcupine?
No way! Only Satan, Prince of Darkness, and King of all evil would do that! Yay!
However, every synopsis I read and every minor detail they talked about in interviews never gave away the jackal's new purpose in the creation of the Antichrist, managing to do the impossible and make the eventual reveal even scarier than anything I could have imagined. The very idea that these nuns and priests in charge of an orphanage could be grooming one of the children under their care for breeding stock. Ugh. And that's not even the worst of it. In a twist you might have clued into fairly quickly, once Margaret and a sympathetic priest bring Carlita's and the rest of the Skiana files to Father Brennan to confirm how she was conceived, they discover that she was not the only successful birth from their demented experiments. And looking closer at the missing baby's file, remembering a few nights after the club when she last saw Paolo, warning her to look for the mark, Margaret puts 2 and 2 together. Or in this case, 6 and 6 and 6.
Carlita must be too young, so they brought Margaret back to Rome
To what? To what?
It's safe to say that this movie owes as much to Rosemary's Baby as it does to the original Omen. And it's probably not for nothing that both movies were released before and after Roe v. Wade in the United States. Roe v. Wade, of course, being the famous, or infamous depending on who you talk to, Supreme Court ruling for the constitutional right to an abortion in 1973, overruled nearly 50 years later in 2022. Rosemary's Baby never really touches on the topic of abortion, but it remains no less influential in movies concerning supernatural pregnancies like The First Omen, due to its themes of the exploitation and dehumanization of women compared to the fetuses they can potentially carry. Throughout the movie, the titular Rosemary's concerns regarding her difficult pregnancy are ignored or rebuffed by the people around her, including her own husband, and she becomes increasingly worried that these same people who claim to be offering support plan to use her impending baby for their own nefarious purposes. And, at the risk of spoiling a 55-year-old movie, said baby also turns out to be the Antichrist.
What have you done to him, you maniac?
Satan is his father, not Guy.
If there's one thing both Rosemary's Baby and The First Omen do exceptionally well, it's making you feel a sense of empathetic defilement during the almost trance-like conception scenes, where the victims are clearly not in the right state of mind to consent, and the indifferent zealots around them stand watch in horrible reverence, using their bodies as a commodity to obtain their selfish goals. It's difficult to talk candidly about these moments due to how intentionally uncomfortable they are, even more uncomfortable in Rosemary's case concerning Roman Polanski's sordid history. and for how YouTube punishes videos that speak candidly on these issues, without using triple-layered coded words that make the original severity of these actions lose all meaning.
Let's be more specific. Are we talking about number one or cocky duty?
Well, let's say for the sake of argument, cocky duty.
But on the A word, it's interesting to point out how said subject is broached in the First Omen compared to the original 1976 movie. In the latter, as the eventual adopted parents of Damien start to become wary of his behavior and the creepy situations that unfold around him, his mom, Catherine, admits to her husband that she doesn't want any more children due to the amount of stress Damien is unintentionally giving her, which her husband initially accepts.
Then you'll agree to an abortion. I'm pregnant, Robert. I just found out this morning.
Though Robert at least goes to speak with Catherine's psychiatrist, who confirms it would be the best thing for her mental health. He refuses to consent on the grounds that some guy, Brennan, said that some demonic force would try to terminate the pregnancy.
I'm going to fight to see that it's not.
Even if Robert is a supportive husband, much more supportive than Rosemary's at the very least, it's still a bit skeevy that the impetus of what his wife does with her body falls upon him. A product of the movie's time, sure, but no less a grim reminder of how much emphasis we can put on potential lives over a potential mother's. Meanwhile, in the First Omen, upon learning that she's due for an expedited pregnancy in just a few hours, Margaret immediately says,
"Then I need it out of me. I need it out of me now."
I'm not trying to shame the original movie for having some unfortunate connotations in hindsight. I'm merely pointing out the shifting attitudes towards a woman's right to choose in the span of 50 years. And seeing it within the same franchise is super interesting, if nothing else. It's also worth pointing out that Margaret might have some anxieties towards pregnancy in general, as one of the film's already infamous moments demonstrates. You see, the Abbey doubles as a birthing ward for unmarried and quickly expectant mothers, and one such person delivers their baby within the first few days of Margaret's stay. And it may just be her subconscious memories of the night before, but when Margaret looks in on the operation and sees what should be a baby crowning, well... See, I told you it would make sense. It's never stated one way or the other what Margaret thinks about the joy of childbirth, but it wouldn't be completely out of the question if she did fear it to some degree. Because, contrary to the sanitized and glamorized depictions we typically see, pregnancy is anything but clean or glamorous.
Is this you being bored? Ah!
If all of this is making me sound anti-pregnancy or anti-baby, I can assure you I'm not. If you want to have babies, then go have some babies. It's entirely your call. And that's the point. Such a decision should entirely be your call. There was a time when I thought about having kids before entering any kind of serious relationship, mainly because it was just something you were expected to do as an adult. Go to college, get married, have kids, wallow in the mines of capitalism for 40 years, and then you die. But after starting a relationship with my wife over 7 years ago, and being around children on a more regular basis, I kind of realized that it really was one of those things that I had in mind only because it was expected of me. Not from anyone specifically, just society at large. You see it all the time where a woman's worth is tied directly into them having babies, both from conservative and supposedly left-leaning spaces.
What the fuck?
But the one thing society at large doesn't really tell you is all the complications that can come from pregnancy and giving birth. The potential years of postpartum pain due to a broken tailbone or tears, not to mention the emotional toll it can take on the person before and well after the fact. Pregnancy is something that no person who is able to give birth should be forced into. And the more I became aware of that, the more I was put off the idea of having kids of my own. So you can imagine that the climax of this movie, involving Margaret being forced into a C-section by the members of the conspiracy, including Cardinal Lawrence, whom she trusted like a father, is perhaps one of the most uncomfortable experiences I've ever had in a movie theater. When I saw this movie opening night, it was a decently packed crowd with a lot of teenagers who were a bit rowdy in the beginning. But once the first pregnancy scene happened, the chatter was over. And by the time of Margaret's C-section, you could practically hear a pin drop, were it not for the poor woman pleading to the indifferent nuns and priests around her that she's in pain and desperately doesn't want to go through with this. And once the pregnancy is complete and they have what they want, Margaret is still just an afterthought to them. She has to remind Cardinal Lawrence that she's still there. And the pisser has the absolute gall to tell her that God is proud of her as she holds her son.
Don't you hear his voice?
I only hear my own.
The First Omen stands in a class by itself even among the other films in the Omen franchise, because it places so much emphasis on a woman's voice in manners such as these. Margaret, through the realization that she had been groomed and set up like a lamb to slaughter all her life, finally finds her own voice and asserts her own desires, even if the conspirators ultimately get what they want in the end. There is some small victory in that Margaret and Carlita managed to escape from them, and that the other baby she was forced to deliver, Damien's twin sister, who is also resoundingly ignored in his favor, is now able to grow up in a loving environment far away from that kind of trauma, at least for now. True, this being a prequel, it was always inevitable that the terrible events of the original movie would come to pass. But in discussing and dissecting these themes, and giving Margaret such a compelling character arc, it manages to not feel like a waste of time the way other prequel films do. That it strengthens the lore of the original film, rather than diminishing it. To the point where it seems like I really have no complaints about it, right? Well, if I'm allowed to nitpick. Although my nitpicks are considerably less than before the film came out, there are still a few grievances I can and will air as an Omen aficionado. An Omen-anadio, if you like. While dating the movie in 1971 makes sense on a practical level, it presents a bit of a wrinkle to the timeline of the original trilogy, if indeed they plan on treating the second and third films as canon. The timeline of the Omen films has always been kinda funky in that regard, with Omen 3 explicitly mentioning an upcoming election in '84. But one thing about the original movie is that nothing about it really screams 1976 to me. Sure, the fashion is pretty 70s at times, as are the lax airplane security measures. But in trying to root the prequel as firmly 1971, I find that the film kind of has to go a bit overboard in establishing its time setting sometimes. Sort of like how everything set in the 1980s has to really shove it in your face that it's the 80s through various bits of nostalgia baiting.
It's the 80s, do a lot of coke and vote for Ronald Reagan.
There are also numerous callbacks, or forwards, to the infamous death scenes of the original, which are, for the most part, increasingly excellent, as each of them have a noticeable yoink and twist element to keep even those who are deeply familiar with the original on their toes. In all the trailers concerning the pipe falling from the steeple, I feared it was going to be just a lazy copy of Father Brennan's death in the original. But nope, the poor schmuck who gets it this time arguably gets it much worse. Paolo's death, which calls back to David Warner's Jennings receiving decapitation via truck,
Decapitation!
is taken one step further by receiving a bifurcation via truck, with a little misguided help from Margaret for good measure. Both these examples are great, even if I would have preferred seeing fresher deaths in a new Omen movie. But the one callback yoink and twist that doesn't really work for me is the death of a nun named Angelica, played by Ishtar Curry Wilson, who mirrors what is perhaps the original's most iconic death scene from the hapless nanny at Damien's birthday party, standing atop a high precipice and taking a fatal plunge after saying,
"It's all for you."
The only difference this time is that she sets herself on fire first. I don't know, it just didn't feel as creative as the others to me. The movie's final scene also felt a little unnecessary. It seemed like everything was wrapping up into a neat package after Margaret and Carlita escape the burning abbey with the baby, where we see the conspirators begin their plan to do a switcheroo between Damien and the soon-to-be dead child of Robert and Catherine, complete with a tasteful posthumous cameo from Gregory Peck. I thought for sure that as the scene played out, we'd get a repeat of the very first lines from the original movie, creating a perfect synergy between the two films, and an excellent lead-in for any who wanted to watch the original immediately after.
The child is dead. He breathed for a moment. Then he breathed no more.
Instead, we get another scene set a few years later, showing Margaret and Carlita's life with their new sister-daughter. Fine enough on its own, but Brennan soon comes to warn them that the conspirators know they're alive and will be coming for them. Then clumsily drops Damien's name like he was building up to the next MCU movie or something.
They've even given it a name. Your son, Damien.
You know, after everything she went through to birth him, pardon my French, but why the fuck would Margaret care what they named that boy?
Oh hey, that kid you were groomed all your life to forcibly give birth to? His name's Damien. Just so you know.
I don't care!
I don't know, you had a good thing going with your ending, the last scene just kind of gilded the lily, even if it was just meant to tease the possibility of a continuation. And then there's my biggest nitpick that might draw some ire from certain horror fans. I'm not completely in love with this movie's soundtrack. And the reason I hesitate to say that is because the movie's composer, Mark Corbin, is certainly no slouch when it comes to the horror genre. Though he's had steady work since the 1980s, Corbin's made a name for himself in the past few years, scoring some very high-profile horror films, including Robert Eggers' debut feature, The Witch, which is what really put him on the map. The tense use of dissonant vocals and discordant strings really helped to sell that movie's cerebral and wooded horror. And much of what made that score so effective is repeated here in The First Omen, albeit with a more cathedral flair. And though it is effectively creepy and haunting in its own right, it's not quite to the same level of creepy and haunting that I've come to expect for an Omen movie. The original soundtrack by Jerry Goldsmith still manages to creep me out as I rewatch the movie, even for what must be the 50th time, especially through its use of a demonic choir chanting praise of Satan either in muted anticipation or frenzied shouting. There's very little of that demonic choir in this movie, and that was a bit of a disappointment to me. It's still leagues better than the soundtrack for the 2006 remake, to be sure. But I think I just have to accept that nobody can top Jerry Goldsmith's scores in this series and level my expectations accordingly. Or I'm just a stickler. Probably that. For every nitpick I have, though, there's plenty about this movie that makes me forgive and forget them the more I think about it. And even some nitpicks I might have had going in or after my first viewing have more or less subsided as time goes on. Yeah, retconning the Jackal from being Damien's mother to his father may not make a lot of sense if you're trying to keep a tight continuity. But there is enough wiggle room even in the original where the Jackal's gender was never really mentioned. I mean, Father Brendan never did get to finish his sentence when he was trying to warn Robert the first time.
What is it that you're trying to say? His mother was a...
Cole's daughter. On that note, while you could argue that Ralph Ineson isn't really a one-for-one match for Patrick Troughton in terms of looks and especially voice.
My name is Father Brennan. I apologize for startling you.
Drink the blood of Christ and eat his flesh. For only if he is within you can you defeat the son of the devil.
The simple fact that it's Ralph frickin' Ineson was more than enough to bring me on board. He's fantastic in everything he's in, seriously. And though I just made a big stink about how Corbin's score doesn't quite feel like an Omen movie's score to me, the way that he finally uses the original's iconic theme, Ave Satani, is such an epic mic drop that any other complaint I had with this score was instantly forgiven.
It was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
All in all, The First Omen was way better than it had any right to be, even if there are little discrepancies and nitpicks you can still have with it. It balanced the line between being a great addition to the series and a great film in its own right, even if you hadn't seen any of the others. And with all that said and all the praise it's gotten from me and everyone else, it burns me so much that it still kind of failed at the box office. It's not entirely a secret that movies in general have struggled ever since the COVID-19 pandemic. Looking at some of the numbers for what should have been surefire hits from last summer alone shows that even established franchises like Mission Impossible or Indiana Jones could still struggle and perform well below expectations. And sure, sometimes we can be a bit hasty in declaring anything a box office bomb when it underperforms even just a little. But there's been a definite shift pre- and post-pandemic when it comes to the general movie-going public. And comparatively smaller budget horror flicks that might have made more than enough in the past are floundering as a result. And while The First Omen wasn't a complete financial disaster, it still made about $7 million short of breaking even with a $30 million budget. And that's without getting into marketing costs. So the question remains of nearly every big budget release these days. Why?
Why?
Well, there's a multitude of factors to consider here. I'm no box office expert myself, but based on pure observation,
why is Chubby here staring at me?
It is kind of telling that this movie was never really intended for a theatrical release in the first place. Originally, it was meant to go straight to streaming, but the writers and SAG-AFTRA strikes of last year saw a delay in a number of film productions, leaving a pretty big gap that Disney needed to fill. I'm grateful for it, since it gave me the chance to see an Omen movie on the big screen for the first time. But the hasty shift from streaming to theatrical might have contributed to a somewhat confused marketing campaign. I mean, I already praised the first major trailer and retro trailer, but some of the other marketing was a bit weird. Like this mock gender reveal thing they did, which... Gender reveal videos weren't even a thing in the 70s. What is this? To be completely fair, though, this is kind of a hard movie to market given everything I've already talked about. And the Omen brand, while not without its die-hard fans, hi, film freak, nice to meet you, doesn't command the same interest as franchises like Halloween or The Exorcist do. Hell, last year's The Exorcist Believer was near unanimously reviled by anyone who saw it, and it still managed to turn a decent profit under the same budget. It's also not out of the question to assume that many of the normal movie-going public, who might venture out to see the odd movie every so often, have become too used to waiting for something to come out on streaming, and not really bother otherwise. And given that The First Omen was in the top 10 movies streaming on Hulu for a solid number of weeks, it's safe to say that there was an audience for this movie. They just needed a little help finding it. Which is another thing I personally detest about this, the glorious streaming age. It seems like movies are spending less and less time in theaters unless it's the really big releases. And movies that might have found an audience otherwise were thrown at some random streaming service where it can be talked about for a minute or two and then largely forgotten in favor of the next big thing. It's at least nice that word of mouth is spreading now rather than never. But imagine if it had the time to truly build an audience while it was out in theaters. Both times I saw it in theaters, it was a decently packed crowd, even when the second time was a few weeks later. But whatever the reason, it's marketing or it's shoes. The First Omen didn't make the splash that many were probably hoping it would, leaving any potential installments up to question. Because there is actually plenty you could do with these new characters that I certainly wasn't expecting going into it. Damien has a twin sister. The conspirators know Margaret and Carlita are alive. They could either have their plots run concurrently with the sequels or do something completely different from them. Whatever it is they could do, I actually hope they manage to do it. With the added caveat that the trailer for the next movie has to have a throwback to Damien Omen 2's tagline.
The first time was only a warning.
Normally in these prequel films, there's only so much you can do before you bump into the wall that is the original. But depending on how they play their cards, there is potential for more. And that's kind of exciting for me, especially if the people who made this film are involved in any capacity. The First Omen is one of the most tense and uncomfortable horror films I've seen in recent years that didn't have Ari Aster's name attached to it. And the more I've sat with it and dissected its themes, the more I've grown to love it, almost as much as the original in some respects. It treats its horror with craft and suspense, with very little in the way of classical jump scares.
There you are.
And it's chock full of visual symbolism up the wazoo. I haven't even gotten into all the spider and spiderweb imagery in this movie. If you somehow have sat through this whole video without seeing The First Omen, then my God, please go watch this movie. If you have Hulu, stream it. If you have Disney Plus internationally, stream it. If you're in the US, have Disney Plus and a VPN, switch it over to some country with Star and stream it. Let Disney know that there is some interest in this series still, or at the very least, in movies like this. The First Omen may be overly fantastical at times and even a bit melodramatic like the original, but its themes and intimate character moments come from a place of extreme reality. And I'm not sure if you could have achieved the same effect if you didn't have a woman's perspective behind the camera in some way or form. Though I sincerely hope Arkasha Stevenson has never experienced anything that resembles what happened to Margaret, this film still feels deeply personal. And if there's one thing big studios like Disney and their subsidiaries seem to hate these days, it's personality. So please, if you haven't seen this film, I implore you again to go watch it. Obviously, you should also take into consideration all the heavy stuff I mentioned and warned about. But if you feel you can handle it, then I think you're in for a chillingly good time. That is, if you can stomach the idea of several people lying to each other and a somewhat negative portrayal of the Catholic Church. My goodness! Regardless, there's only so much one guy on the internet can cover about any movie for a video. And I hope I've left enough open where you could still be surprised. And now that the movie is out on Blu-ray, I'll happily add it to my collection. In fact, I think I'll go home and watch it right now! Oh, damn it, how does this keep happening? Okay, but real talk. On a scale of Luce from The First Omen to Gwen from Immaculate, how supportive are you of your exploited nun GF?
E qui ognuno di voi dice un sacco di cazzate. Lasciami!